After everything, I almost gave up hope. We're together now. That's all that matters.
The telegram arrived on the worst day of Jacob Mercer's life. He stood in the dusty yard of the Triple M Ranch, watching the bank assessor measure his land with cold, calculating eyes. When young Timothy from the telegraph office came galloping up the drive, Jacob's father had built this ranch from nothing 30 years ago, carving a life out of the harsh Montana wilderness. Now, 3 months after burying the old man, Jacob was about to lose everything to Eastern bankers who wouldn't know a branding iron from a fence post. The assessor, a thin man in an expensive suit that had no business being this far from civilization, snapped his notebook closed. "Mr. Mercer, without significant capital or collateral, the bank will foreclose in 60 days. I'm sorry, but those are the terms." He wasn't sorry at all. Jacob could see it in the way the man's eyes lingered on the property, already calculating its value at auction. Jacob's hands trembled as he opened the telegram after the assessor departed. It was from his late mother's sister in Boston, a woman he'd met only once as a child. The message was brief and businesslike. "Understand you need wife to satisfy loan terms? Have suitable candidate? Catherine Hayes, schoolteacher, respectable family, fallen on hard times. Will arrive Billings Station Thursday next. Aunt Margaret." He read it 3 times, his chest tightening with each pass. The loan officer had mentioned it almost as an afterthought during their last meeting. Married men with families were better risks, he'd said. The bank preferred to lend to settlers who were putting down roots, building something permanent. A bachelor rancher in his 30s, alone on a failing spread, looked like a man ready to cut his losses and run. Jacob walked to the house his father had built, its logs still solid despite the weathering of countless Montana winters. Inside, dust motes danced in the afternoon light streaming through windows his mother had once kept spotless. The place felt like a museum now, a monument to a family that no longer existed. His mother had died when he was 15. His father had followed her this past spring, his heart simply giving out during branding season. Now Jacob was the last Mercer, watching everything his family had sacrificed for slip through his fingers. He looked at the telegram again. Catherine Hayes, he didn't even know what she looked like. What kind of woman agreed to marry a stranger and move to the middle of nowhere? What kind of man bought himself a wife like she was livestock at auction? The whole thing made him sick, but the alternative was worse. Without the ranch, he was nothing. This land was all he'd ever known, all he'd ever wanted. It was in his blood, in his bones. Jacob moved to the window and stared out at the rolling grassland that stretched toward the distant mountains. Cattle grazed in the lower pasture, their coats gleaming red and white in the sun. His breeding stock, carefully selected over years, represented the best bloodlines in the territory. With time and luck and a lot of hard work, he could build something here that would last generations. But time was the one thing he didn't have. Thursday was 5 days away. 5 days to clean up the house, prepare himself to meet a woman who would become his wife, and figure out how to live with the knowledge that he'd essentially purchased another human being to save his land. Jacob folded the telegram and slipped it into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. The decision was made. Catherine Hayes was coming, and somehow he'd have to make this work. The Billings train station was more crowded than Jacob had ever seen it. He stood near the platform, his best hat in his hands, watching passenger after passenger step down from the cars. He'd worn his Sunday suit, the one he saved for church and funerals, and his boots were polished to a shine that would have made his mother proud. Still, he felt like a fraud, playing dress-up while he waited to collect a woman like she was a mail-order package. When he finally saw her, his breath caught in his throat. Catherine Hayes stepped onto the platform carrying a worn leather valise, her dark hair pinned up beneath a simple hat. She wasn't beautiful in the flashy way of saloon girls or the porcelain way of the wealthy women in town. She was something different. There was a steadiness in the way she moved, a quiet dignity in how she surveyed the crowd with intelligent gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Jacob approached slowly, suddenly aware of how rough his hands were, how his neck was burned dark from years in the sun. "Miss Hayes?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. She turned to face him, and he saw the moment she recognized him, saw her shoulders straighten as she prepared herself. "Mr. Mercer." She didn't smile, but she didn't look afraid either. I appreciate you coming to meet me. The ride back to the ranch was awkward, filled with long silences broken by stilted attempts at conversation. Jacob learned that she was 26, had been teaching at a girls' school in Boston until it closed, and that her father had died leaving nothing but debts. Her mother had passed years before. She asked practical questions about the ranch, about the house, about what would be expected of her. She didn't once ask about love or romance or any of the things he imagined women usually cared about. It was a business arrangement, and she treated it as such. "I want to be clear about something," Catherine said as the ranch came into view. "Your aunt's letter explained the situation. You need a wife to secure your loan, and I need security. I understand the terms. But I won't be treated as property, Mr. Mercer. I'll be a partner in this arrangement, or I'll take the next train back to Boston." Jacob pulled the wagon to a stop and looked at her directly for the first time since they'd left town. "I don't want property, Miss Hayes. I want to save my ranch, and apparently I need a wife to do it. But I'm not looking to own anybody. My mother ran this house and half the ranch operations besides. She was my father's equal in every way that mattered. I won't expect less from you, and I won't offer less in return." Something shifted in her expression, a slight softening around her eyes. "Then we understand each other." The house seemed different when he showed her inside, seen through her eyes. He noticed the dust he'd tried to clean, the bare spaces where his mother's things had been, the masculine simplicity of a place that hadn't known a woman's touch in years. Catherine walked through each room silently, her fingers trailing along the furniture, pausing at the windows to look out at the land. "It's beautiful," she said finally, and he heard genuine appreciation in her voice. Lonely but beautiful. They were married 3 days later in the small church in town, with only the minister and his wife as witnesses. Catherine wore a simple blue dress she'd brought with her, and Jacob wore the same suit he'd worn to meet her at the station. The words of the ceremony felt surreal, like they were happening to someone else. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, Jacob kissed her cheek awkwardly, and Catherine's face flushed pink. That night, Catherine took the bedroom that had been his parents', and Jacob bedded down in his old room, the one he'd slept in as a boy. Through the thin walls, he could hear her moving around, settling in. He stared at the ceiling, wondering what he'd done, wondering if this stranger sleeping in his house could really help him save the ranch, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake that would haunt them both. The first week was harder than Jacob had imagined. Catherine moved through the house like a ghost, efficient and quiet, never quite comfortable. She cooked meals that were better than anything he'd managed on his own, kept the house cleaner than it had been in years, but there was a distance between them that felt impossible to cross. They were strangers sharing a space, nothing more. The bank officer came out to the ranch on the 8th day. Harold Jensen was a different sort than the assessor, a local man who'd known Jacob's father. He looked over the marriage certificate Catherine produced, examined the household she'd established, and nodded slowly. "This changes things," he admitted. "The bank's willing to extend the loan terms, give you another year to make the payments. But Jacob, you'll need to show profit. Real profit. The cattle market's been down, and I can only protect you so much." After Jensen left, Jacob found Catherine in the kitchen garden his mother had once tended. She was on her knees in the dirt, pulling weeds from around the struggling plants. "You don't have to do that," he said. "The garden's been let go for years." She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "Everything here has been let go, Mr. Mercer. The house, the garden, even you, if you don't mind me saying so. A person can only carry so much grief before it starts to bury them." Her words struck something deep inside him. "Jacob," he said quietly. "If we're married, you should call me Jacob." "Jacob, then?" She turned back to the weeds. "And you should call me Kate?" Catherine always sounded too formal, even back in Boston. He knelt beside her, his large hands clumsy with the delicate plants. "My mother loved this garden. After she died, my father couldn't bring himself to tend it. Hurt too much, I think." He paused, pulling up a stubborn weed. "I should have kept it up, but I didn't know how." They worked in silence for a while, and somehow it felt less awkward than the silences in the house. Out here, with their hands in the dirt, they were just two people trying to make something grow. Kate glanced at him occasionally, and he caught her studying his face when she thought he wasn't looking. "Tell me about the ranch," she said eventually. Not the business parts. Tell me why you love it. Jacob sat back, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked out at the land stretching away from them, the mountains rising purple in the distance. When I was a boy, my father brought me out to the north pasture during calving season. There was a heifer having trouble with her first calf. We worked half the night helping her. When that calf finally stood up on wobbly legs and started nursing, my father put his hand on my shoulder and said, "This is what we do, Jacob. We help things live. That's what this place is to me. It's not just land or cattle or money. It's about helping things live and grow." Kate's expression softened in a way he hadn't seen before. "That's beautiful," she said. "Your father sounds like he was a good man. He was—" Jacob's throat tightened. "I just hope I can live up to what he built here." Over the following weeks, something began to change between them. Kate took interest in the ranch operations, asking questions about the cattle, the breeding program, the markets. She had a quick mind for numbers and started keeping the ranch books, organizing records that Jacob had let fall into chaos. She found inefficiencies he'd never noticed, suggested improvements that actually made sense. But it was the small moments that really shifted things. Kate laughing when one of the barn cats brought her a mouse as a gift. Jacob teaching her to ride, his hand steadying her as she learned to post in the saddle. Evenings on the porch after dinner, watching the sun set over the mountains while they talked about everything and nothing. The way she hummed while she worked in the kitchen, bringing music back into a house that had been silent too long. Jacob caught himself watching her more and more, noticing the way lamplight caught in her hair, the strength in her hands, the quick intelligence in her eyes. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was a business arrangement, a solution to a problem. But somewhere between the garden and the bookkeeping and the quiet evenings, she'd become something more. She'd become Kate, and he was starting to realize that saving the ranch might not be the only thing at stake anymore. The trouble started when James Harrington rode onto the Triple M like he owned it. Jacob was in the barn shoeing a horse when he heard the expensive horse's hooves on the packed dirt of the yard. He stepped out to see a man in his 40s, well-dressed and confident, dismounting with the easy grace of someone who'd spent his life on horseback. But these weren't working horses. This was money. "You must be Mercer," Harrington said, extending his hand. "James Harrington. I own the Bar H over the ridge from your northern boundary." Jacob shook his hand warily. He'd heard of Harrington. The man had bought up 3 smaller ranches in the past 2 years, consolidating land until his spread was one of the biggest in the territory. "What can I do for you?" "Actually, I'm here to do something for you." Harrington's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "I hear you've had some financial difficulties. I'd like to make you an offer on your land, a generous offer. Enough to pay off your debts and set you up somewhere else with money to spare." Jacob's jaw tightened. "The Triple M isn't for sale." "Everything's for sale, Mercer. It's just a matter of price." Harrington pulled out a cigar, lit it. "I'll give you time to think about it. Talk it over with that new wife of yours." "Smart woman would tell you to take the money and run?" Kate appeared on the porch then, drawn by the voices. Harrington's eyes swept over her with an appraising look that made Jacob's blood boil. "Mrs. Mercer, a pleasure. I hope you're settling into ranch life. Though I have to wonder if a Boston schoolteacher might not prefer the comforts of town. My offer would certainly allow for that." "Mr. Harrington," Kate's voice was ice. "My husband has already declined your offer. I believe your business here is concluded." Harrington smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, but the offer stands. When things get tough, Mercer, and they will, you remember I'm willing to pay fair value." "More than fair." He swung back into his saddle with practiced ease. "I'll be in touch." After he left, Kate came down from the porch. "Who was that?" "Trouble," Jacob said. "He's been buying up all the smaller ranches, pushing people out. Now he's got his eye on our land." That night, as they sat reviewing the ranch books, Kate pointed out something that made Jacob's stomach drop. "Look at these supply invoices. The prices have increased significantly over the past month. And this note from the feed store, they're demanding payment in advance now instead of extending credit." Jacob ran his hand through his hair. "Harrington. Has to be. He's got influence in town. He's making it harder for us to operate." "Then we need to be smarter," Kate said, her finger tracing down the columns of numbers. "We can't outspend him, but we can outthink him." These breeding records you've kept, Jacob, they're meticulous. Your bloodlines are some of the best I've seen in any of the ranch journals. What if we focused on that? Quality over quantity. They worked late into the night, Kate's business sense combining with Jacob's ranching knowledge to develop a new plan. Somewhere around midnight, exhausted and caffeinated on strong coffee, Jacob looked across the table at her. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and there was ink on her cheek where she'd absently rubbed her face. She was beautiful. "I couldn't do this without you," he said quietly. Kate looked up, meeting his eyes. "Yes, you could, but I'm glad you don't have to." The moment stretched between them, charged with something unspoken. Jacob started to reach across the table, and Kate leaned forward slightly. Then a log shifted in the fireplace with a sharp crack, and the spell broke. They both pulled back, suddenly awkward. "It's late," Kate said, gathering the papers. "We should get some sleep." But that night, lying in his narrow bed, Jacob couldn't sleep. He thought about Kate in the next room, wondered if she was awake too. Wondered if she felt this pull between them, this thing that was growing despite their practical arrangement. He'd married her to save his land, but now the thought of her leaving, of her taking that train back to Boston, was worse than the thought of losing the ranch. When had that happened? When had she become more important than everything he'd thought he was fighting for? In her room, Kate lay awake as well, staring at the ceiling. She thought about Jacob's hands, rough and capable, about the way he talked about the ranch with such passion, about the man who helped things live and grow. She'd come here expecting duty and survival. She hadn't expected to care, hadn't expected to lie awake wanting to cross the hallway between their rooms, wanting to tell him that this arrangement didn't feel like business anymore. It felt like something else entirely, something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The spring roundup came just as Harrington's pressure intensified. The feed store refused their credit entirely, forcing Jacob to pay cash they couldn't spare. 2 of their ranch hands quit suddenly, hired away by the Bar H at wages Jacob couldn't match. It seemed like everything was conspiring against them, but Kate refused to give up. She rode out with Jacob during the roundup, shocking the remaining hands by working alongside them. She learned to rope and brand, her hands blistering and bleeding until they hardened. At night, she recalculated their finances, finding pennies to save, figuring out how to stretch every dollar. And through it all, she and Jacob grew closer, their partnership deepening into something neither of them could deny anymore. The breaking point came on a warm afternoon in late May. Jacob was in the north pasture when he saw smoke rising from the direction of the ranch house. His heart stopped. He spurred his horse into a gallop, terror clawing at his chest. All he could think was Kate. Kate was at the house. When he crested the ridge, he saw flames engulfing the barn. Not the house, thank God, but the barn where they kept feed, equipment, everything they needed for the summer. And in front of the barn, Kate was organizing the hands, directing them with a bucket brigade from the well, her face smudged with soot but her voice calm and commanding. Jacob leaped from his horse and ran to help. They fought the fire for hours, and though they saved the horses and most of the equipment, the barn was a total loss. As the last embers died, Jacob sank to his knees in the dirt, covered in ash and sweat. Everything was gone. There was no way they could rebuild, no way to pay for the loss. Harrington had won. He felt Kate's hand on his shoulder. "Get up," she said firmly. "This isn't over. Kate, we can't—" "Get up, Jacob Mercer." Her voice was steel. "Your father didn't give up. Your mother didn't give up. And I didn't come all the way from Boston to watch you surrender now." He looked up at her. This woman he'd barely known 3 months ago, standing strong while everything burned down around them. And suddenly he was standing, pulling her into his arms, holding her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had gone mad. "I love you," he said into her hair, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I know that wasn't part of the arrangement. I know this was supposed to be business, but God help me, Kate. I love you." She pulled back just enough to look at him, tears cutting tracks through the soot on her cheeks. "You foolish man," she whispered. "I've loved you since you knelt in the garden and told me about helping things live." Then she kissed him, and it was nothing like their awkward wedding kiss. It was real and desperate and full of everything they'd been holding back. The next morning, they rode into town together. Kate marched into the bank with the confidence of a woman on a mission. She'd been writing letters, it turned out, to her old connections in Boston. She'd found investors interested in Jacob's breeding program, people willing to put money into quality bloodlines. And she'd found something else too, evidence that Harrington had been paying people to cause them trouble, including the man who'd set the barn fire. Harold Jensen listened to everything, examined Kate's documents, and made some decisions that bankers rarely make. He extended their loan again, helped arrange a meeting with the territorial marshal about Harrington's activities, and even consigned a loan for a new barn. "Your father was a good man, Jacob," he said. "And you've got a hell of a wife. The bank believes in the Triple M." Harrington was arrested a week later. It turned out he'd been running similar schemes across the territory, driving people out through intimidation and sabotage. With him gone, the Triple M began to recover. The new barn went up quickly with help from neighbors who'd been too afraid of Harrington to assist before. Kate's investors came through, and Jacob's breeding program started to generate real income. But the real change was in the house. Jacob moved his things into Kate's room one evening without discussing it, and she simply smiled and helped him unpack. They stopped being business partners pretending to be married and became a real husband and wife, partners in every sense of the word. A year later, standing in that same north pasture where his father had taught him about helping things live, Jacob watched Kate teaching their newborn daughter how to touch a calf gently. The Triple M was thriving, the herd was growing, and the ranch his father built would pass to another generation. But the ranch wasn't what he thought about most anymore. He'd bought a bride to save his land, but Kate had saved something far more important. She'd saved him from loneliness, from grief, from a life of just surviving instead of living. She'd saved his heart, and in doing so, she'd given him back himself. Kate looked up and caught him watching. "What are you thinking?" she called out. He walked over and put his arm around her, looking down at their daughter's tiny face. "I'm thinking," he said, "that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst circumstances. I'm thinking that I'm the luckiest man in Montana." Kate leaned into him, and he felt her smile against his shoulder. "We're both lucky," she said. "We found each other." And there, on the land his father had carved from wilderness, Jacob Mercer finally understood what home really meant. It wasn't just the land or the cattle or the buildings. Home was Kate's laugh in the morning, her hand in his at night, and the future they were building together. He'd set out to save his ranch, but in the end, love had saved them both.